So I'm going to introduce now Justin Corbett, who's on my immediate left. Justin is the author of the South Kordofan Nuba Sudan study, and he's an independent consultant with over 20 years of experience working with local communities, governments, and aid organizations in Africa and Asia. He focuses on community empowerment, civil society governance, and capacity building. Justin.
Thank you, Wendy. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming. I had a chance to work in South Kordofan during the latter part of the war that finished in 2005. And the research I was looking at was carried out during the ceasefire period between 2005, which lasted up to, tragically, war restarting in June of last year. And this meant that we all felt a bit uncomfortable with this study at the start, that it was seeming a bit academic. Tragically became a lot more applied, in that a lot of the work and the lessons we were trying to bring together during 2010 and 11, we then had an opportunity to see how local people could use them in the face of a new war. So what I'm going to share with you today is both some key parts of the lesson learning from the previous war in the Nuba Mountains, which was from 1986 up to 2005, and then what has happened since, to some extent, since June of last year in a war that is ongoing as we speak. Okay, I think the first point that came out very clearly from people's perceptions during the last war, that any attempt to try and separate out issues of physical safety, livelihoods, rights, was not relevant to their understanding at all. They saw all of these things very much interrelated. So what came out of a lot of discussions there was that people did not see it useful for outsiders to be designing projects that just look at these things individually. A quote perhaps from a woman interviewed was that, as citizens of Sudan, do we not have the right to grow food for our family or to drink water? In the war, we risked being shot, raped, or imprisoned when we went to our fields or wells. We die because we have no rights. So they really see that these issues of physical safety, livelihoods, and lack of rights are interconnected. And they died from, they saw the lack of those three things happening. That has meant that in efforts to try and help people cope with the current conflict, we've been seeing what are the opportunities to develop a strategy that, from its beginning looks at a much more integrated and holistic approach that tries to combine strengthening local capacity for physical protection against war with livelihood issues. Most people during the last war actually died from starvation or disease rather than bullets or bombs. And how this relates to human rights violations, either people's own awareness of human rights or what advocacy can be doing to promote human rights. Second key point that's been, very strong with all the findings is that local people were the primary protectors of themselves and their families. Tragically, in both these wars, there has been no international assistance of any sort in protection. So this is, people have had to do this, but it's meant that there's been quite an opportunity to see how people protect themselves with very, very little resources. And in Nuba example, immediately people come up with three things they talk about. They talk about the physical safety of their knowledge of their landscape, the mountains, and hiding in caves or in highland territories, moving their homes, and everything that goes with that. So the fact that they have varieties of sorghum that can grow up there, that they have different varieties of livestock that can survive in the mountains. The second thing was around wild foods. Wild foods played an essential role in keeping people alive, and local medicines as well, herbal medicines. And we're already seeing that at the moment in Nuba. The death rates from malnutrition would be much higher right now if it wasn't for the fact that for some families now about 70% of their consumption is wild foods. So in looking at how we can strengthen local capacity just around those two issues, one sees that the chance for disseminating local varieties of crops or of livestock that may be present in some areas of the mountains and not in others can have a big impact. The disseminated of knowledge that we found different villages have different levels of knowledge of ethnobotany, of local wild foods and medicines. So you have experts in different areas and different traditions. You can do a lot by helping just spread the knowledge that people already have. And this is, even in the last 6 months, has had quite an impact. The third area that people came up with in terms of what kept them alive was a little bit more difficult to describe with one word. It's something to do with the sense of unity or sharing or belongingness, the jargon we use like social capital, and but self-help basically, how people help themselves, and the importance of that solidarity and unity. This came up again and again, and because both towards the end of the last war and during the peace agreement, a lot of NGOs finally did start to try and do something. It was raised that interventions that might in any way weaken local solidarity or trust or unity can have quite a negative effect. So the opportunities to strengthen that were highlighted. Those examples of protection were coming up from sort of family level. At a slightly higher level, local civil society played a key role in getting organized, whether as NGOs or as smaller groups. And not just local civil society, but local civil structures. Within any protracted war like that, almost inevitably there are local structures on the ground that are trying to do something, and this was the same case in South Kordofan during the last war. So there was a wide network of voluntary teachers, voluntary health workers who had schools under trees and clinics in the caves, and some level of management from the local authorities, the civil administration. And there was a lot of opportunity to work with that structure. Again, from a humanitarian point of view, this sometimes upsets some agencies because they are seen to be politically affiliated. Of course they are. And this is another point that keeps coming up. I think if humanitarians want to be effective in these situations, we've got to start learning how to engage with local structures that have a political affiliation, but how we can work with them to meet humanitarian needs. Okay, just dipping into a few other points. Oh, how long have I got?
3 minutes.
3 minutes, oh, right. Psychological needs came up again and again. Psychological is not a very good term here either. What I mean is the needs that go beyond just food and water. This is linked perhaps a little bit to this issue of solidarity and unity, but just people expressing how important it was for them to have opportunities to live during a protracted crisis, a protracted conflict, to meet their other needs as human beings. There were a couple of nice quotes and things like that. Another woman said, "We're not animals. We don't just need food and water to live. we like to make ourselves look beautiful and dance even when we're hungry. I remember during the last war, and there might be other people in the audience who know this too, that when dealing with some of the NGOs who were trying to get food in through the very limited air bridge that was set up, we failed to get an endorsement to put things on like hair extension. Now, women there were, and beads and things, very important for local women, even when they were, you know, close to death's door, for this same reason. It doesn't take up any weight. And the reason that the NGOs were worried about this was, you know, about donor compliance and how this might look publicly. How strange, isn't it, when the very people who are protecting themselves and identifying what they think might actually help them, you know, we find that the mainstream humanitarian mechanism can't actually deliver that because it doesn't fit into our box. You don't give hair extensions when people are dying in a war, say we. So those, you know, making sure that interventions from outside look at these other parts of what it is that's important. Guitar strings we took in not so long ago made a huge difference. Musicians in Nuba culture are very important and keep up people's morale. Being able to have weddings and have some sort of traditional ceremony still, despite you know, having to get into foxholes during the bombing raids. We've had a chance over the last 6 months to look at how to bring some of this together in practice, and one of several initiatives born out of this current conflict has been setting up teams of local protection volunteers, young men and women in Nuba who were assigned different parts of the mountains, and whose role was basically about trying to disseminate, share this collected knowledge and ideas between villages. So they were mobile, walking between villages and either sharing pre-planned advice that had been gleaned out of the research, or very often sharing new ideas that were being generated sort of weekly as people are readapting to a new conflict. So this is sometimes very practical stuff. A lot of people at the beginning of the war 6 months ago were dying because your immediate reaction when a bomb falls and you hear them whistling down is to get up and run, and most people were killed through shrapnel. So just very simple stuff about how to deal with bombing raids, even if you don't have a foxhole or just about lying flat. Saved an enormous amount of lives. Now, if you can get people to then start digging foxholes, you save even more. So local protection volunteers with nothing have had a big impact just on that. And on top of that, then, looking at the issues of knowledge on wild foods and wild medicines, early warning systems. We found a lot of difference between villages was often down to local leaders or individuals who had particular ideas. So these protection volunteers have managed to somehow iron out or fill in the gaps of knowledge and capacity. And they've had a chance to introduce new ideas, whether it's looking at training on first aid or some primary health care issues. I realise I've got to stop. There's a few other things I'd like to share with you. They're in the report. Perhaps just 2 or 3.
Yes.
Yes, yeah. Good. Women's role as protectors. That, you know, I'm afraid during the last war, and we haven't got enough evidence to know yet during this war, but rape is often, you know, there's a lot of evidence that rape was being used as a weapon of war during the last war. Women, of course, are exposed in going to the wells or going to weed in the fields. However, in talking with women, very surprisingly, many of them felt that they were better equipped to deal with the difficulties of war than their husbands, mentally, and sometimes from a stamina point of view. They were seen as the main protectors of the family at the household level. They either lost their husbands could have been out fighting, or often their husbands were there, but they were less able mentally to cope with the difficulties. So in working with women in conflict, we shouldn't always put them in this sort of vulnerable women box that we do, very often they have the key role in actually keeping together the family. And as local protectors, we're seeing now that, yeah, they have a great deal to offer. I agree with Simon's point and others that in terms of no, actually, that's jumping too far to another thing. It was talking about UNMISS. I'll come back to that if I have a moment during the discussions. Yeah, maybe just two last things to add. I've been talking a lot about the immediate survival mechanisms. A great deal of what we've found from the research and what is now being tried now is looking at advocacy issues and how to help local people on the ground have a voice and reach up to decision makers, whether it's in the UN or the international community. And there's quite a lot of interesting stuff that can be done there, but an understanding of how that can also be used to influence national awareness of what's happening. We've seen more and more as a priority. So the international community continues to be pretty ineffective at doing much in places like South Kordofan. However, the national public of, in this case, the country that is now Sudan, or was North Sudan, are totally uninformed about what is going on in their own country. They have influence over the government. And we realize that so little of our advocacy efforts are aimed at Arabic language awareness raising of the national public. And the research also suggests that cross-conflict communication, even with the armed forces of, in this case, the government of Sudan, could really pay dividends in looking at trying to be part of some conflict transformation process, getting people to look at alternatives to killing. Finally, I think I'll end up with just a dig at all of us that, you know, so much of what we experienced from the last war and so much of what we're experiencing now is revealing the inadequacy of mainstream aid that we're all part of in dealing with these very complicated situations because of the institutional forces that direct our behavior and our decision making. And so often to be effective here, you have to be very opportunistic, you have to be very risk-taking, you have to be very humble about you know, what we can and cannot do. Now, many of the forces acting on us are very different. You know, we have to design pre-planned projects with log frames, with fixed budgets, with donor compliance. We have high risk averseness, and often we don't feel it serves in our interest to be very humble. We like to say, just give us the money and we can sort this out, whereas that's not true. And perhaps the more that we can be challenging ourselves in how mainstream aid doesn't actually work very well in these situations, the more we might move to solutions over the next 5 or 10 years that help us do a bit better. So a bit of honesty and a bit of humility and a bit of creativeness and risk-taking might help a lot. Thank you.
Justin, thanks very much.